My understanding of the science on climate change is that to avoid 2 degrees, more than 2 degrees warming, which is kind of set at the margin of safety, we have to get down to a global average of 1 tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent per person per year, which is what I've used to come here. That's one transatlantic flight there and back. It's a very low quota. It's 1/20th of the average US emissions. It's 1/12th of the average European emissions. It's 1/3 of the average Chinese emissions. So China's already way into the red on its carbon quota. So my understanding is that it's not the problem is not primarily technological, but you could actually a combination of the technologies available and some which are coming on the stream makes it theoretically feasible to get down to 1 tonne per year. The problem is political, and this is where I think the environmental movement does itself a disservice. The environmental movement's full of people who do "if I ruled the world" policy work, where they come up with a grand plan, say, see, it works, and they think they've done their job, and then they just make sort of vague appeal to political will. And I think that's not good enough. So what's interesting for me is in what situations does a global economy with massive investments in, sunk investments in dirty technologies shift to clean technologies? Because that's what's required over the next 10, 20 years. And the only examples, I'd love to hear some sort of some precedents, because the only precedent I can see really on a big scale is wartime, when whole industrial plants move to arms production and out of their standard activity. You have smaller things like bans on nuclear weapons, but they don't have the kind of economic centrality that this thing does. The problem with climate change is that you can't wait for this to be shock driven, because the kind of shock that will produce that sort of transformation in Europe or America is going to only going to happen when things are far too late in other parts of the world. So this has to be politics driven, evidence driven. And I can't see any precedent in history for a change that big happening through. Three possible outcomes. One is that we complete, you could look back and say, look what's been achieved since 1945, decolonisation, end of World War II, phenomenal progress, although the NGOs deny it, phenomenal progress on poverty, social indicators, health indicators, and wouldn't it be great if we could just carry that on to a global minimum safety net thing? We don't have an absurd situation where 850 million people are malnourished and a similar number are obese. We actually get a kind of a basic decency out there. But we've got to do that at the same time as shifting to 1 tonne a day. And I think that's a huge challenge. If we do it, then it'll be this. It'll be some sort of global New Deal, low carbon development instituted rapidly in the fast developing countries, big shift to low carbon models in the rich countries, and we do all that at the same time as reducing inequality. But I have to say, it's a hell of an ask. Another possibility is that the system is resilient. You avoid the big climate change problem, but at the cost of development. So instead of us having 1 tonne each, I have 2 tonnes, you have no tonne. Kind of carbon apartheid springs up, which could be done through the price mechanism if carbon is priced, or it could be done through regulation. Is it really likely that the US negotiators in Kyoto are going to sit down with the Chinese and say, guys, there's 4 times more Chinese people than there are Americans, so of course you can have 4 times more carbon allowance. That's only fair. Is that a likely international negotiation? It's not like anything I've seen. It's much more likely that any negotiated rationing of carbon will also reflect an imbalance of power. Then I think the third possibility is that actually electoral cycles can't deliver negotiated reductions in carbon. It actually waits for the shocks. And so we may survive, you may survive, but lots of other parts of the world will be underwater or impossible to live in. So I think all of those three seem to me distinct possibilities. And I'm not normally apocalyptic. Okay, this isn't what I like doing, but it seems to me that all three are distinct possibilities, and I'm very worried. Okay, I'll finish with 10 challenges that I think the book throws up for NGOs and maybe for the wider development sector. One is, I think if you start from inequality rather than poverty, it takes you to a more interesting place. Inequality is relational. Relationships within houses, within communities, across nations. Inequality is about, and remedies to inequality involve power, involve politics, involve social change. And poverty, especially when reduced to income poverty, can become quite, I think, meaningless. It can become very, very devoid of content compared to the reality of development. So if we could possibly sort of inequalitify the MDGs, So when the Millennium Development Goals finally run out of steam in 2 or 3 years, we have something which talks about inequality, rights, other issues. That would be, I think, a step forward. Discuss. If you think about why people are active citizens, why people leave their homes at the end of a long, hard day and go to meetings of all things, it's more likely to be their faith than an NGO or a political party or a book. And yet, I don't know about America, but certainly in Europe, the development industry is profoundly secular. We live in this kind of Western Enlightenment bubble. We only talk about evidence-based policy making. I've never heard anyone talk about faith-based policy making. And that means we don't actually understand almost anybody. We don't understand our own staff, many of whom are devout believers in one faith or another. We don't understand our own supporters. We don't understand our partners. And we don't understand poor people. Apart from that, we're doing really well, you know. So I think we have to, even if we're not religious ourselves, we actually have to start thinking about what motivates people. World went urban last year, more people living in towns and cities than countryside for the first time in human history. Go to the average NGO website and there will be people standing in fields, people with hoes, people with things on their heads. You know, I sometimes sort of caricature it. Imagine when the last peasant in the world is standing in a field in India somewhere, sort of circa 2100, they will be surrounded by NGOs, you know, saying, come to my seminar, have my grant, don't talk to World Vision, come to us, you know. There's a real sort of peasant romanticism in the NGOs, which means we're massively distorted towards rural stuff. And it worries me. I mean, you can justify it just about if you think about poverty, because 3/4 of the world's poor in rural areas, and it won't become majority urban until about 2040, I think. But you can't justify it if you think about change. You can't think about it in terms of there's 1 billion people in shanty towns now, it's going to be 2 billion in 2030. That's where the new social movements are going to come from, that's where the new political expressions are going to come from. You know, we really need to become urban literate very quickly if we're going to even understand, let alone be part of anything. The states employ millions of people or hundreds of thousands, we employ dozens. You know, in what circumstances can small organisations actually build effective states, or should we leave that up to the big guys and concentrate on active citizenship? I'm collecting some sort of stories for my blog on cases where we've actually been involved in a little bit of state building, either at local level with decentralised administrations, or in some cases like Vietnam when you can actually, you know, use your projects to lever change at the state level. But it's pretty difficult. Migration I've talked about, big gap. Okay, this is a chestnut. You know, a lot of the development organisations are schizophrenic. They have the people who do emergencies, earthquakes, catastrophes, tsunamis, who are, to caricature, can-do people. They're slightly macho. They want to get in there, get the water flowing, get the food in, get the houses up, save lives. They're very passionate about what they do, and they see themselves as apolitical. They are not in there to do politics. They are there to save lives. And then on the other sort of half of our collective brain are the long-term development people who are why-do rather than can-do people. They agonise a lot more. They worry about participation and methods and process. They have lots of meetings and seminars, and they think about empowerment and long-term social change, and they see themselves as change agents. Now the trouble is that's fine, except that shocks are also one of the main times when change happens. So around emergencies, conflicts, natural disasters, economic crises, is precisely when institutions change, social relationships change, political relationships change. So at just the moment when change becomes feasible, all our long-term change agents leave and the engineers come in and don't do politics, right? There's a kind of structural problem. So we need to recognise that shocks are also moments of opportunity and think about what that means in terms of who we employ and how we kind of work together. And then finally, could someone please set up a department for change studies in a good university and try and explain change to us? Because we all talk about change the whole time. Everybody has completely random models of change in their own heads. One person thinks it's always social movements, one person thinks it's always the private sector, you know, one person thinks it's campaigns and popular mobilisation, horrible phrase. No one has any way of arriving at these conclusions. It's just basically what you've seen. So we actually need an analytical framework for change, and this is one of the things I'd love to work on over the next few years, if I'm ever allowed to write another book. Okay, and finally, thank you for listening.